The contractor who showed up to redo my kitchen introduced himself by his first name, and it took me almost 30 seconds standing in my own doorway to place why it sounded so familiar. Nate. My husband used to talk about a guy named Nate from college, the one who stood up at our wedding, the one in half the photo albums I hadn't opened in 3 years. I stood there staring at him, and I watched the exact same recognition land on his face a second later. "Elise?" he said, like he genuinely couldn't believe it either. Neither of us said much else that first afternoon. But over the following 6 weeks, that kitchen renovation turned into something neither of us expected. Old stories I'd never heard about the man I married, a promise I didn't know existed until it was already changing everything, and a question, near the end, that I wasn't sure I was ready to answer honestly. If you've ever had grief hand you something you weren't looking for, stay with me, because this story isn't really about a kitchen. It's about what happens when the past shows up wearing a tool belt, and you have to decide what you're actually allowed to feel next. Quick context before the real story starts. My name's Elise. I lost my husband, Daniel, 3 years ago. A car accident on a road he drove every single day. The kind of ordinary tragedy that makes the world feel permanently unstable afterward. The way it turns a route you've driven 100 times into something you can barely look at again. We'd been married 6 years. He was 34. I was 32. None of the math on that ever stopped feeling wrong to me, no matter how many times well-meaning people told me time would eventually soften it. The 3 years since had settled into a kind of manageable routine. Work, a small circle of friends who'd learned not to tiptoe around Daniel's name anymore, a house I'd slowly, carefully made my own again, instead of a shrine to what used to be there. I wasn't unhappy exactly. I just stopped expecting anything to surprise me. Nate had been Daniel's closest friend since college. I'd met him maybe 3 times total over the years, always in passing, always with Daniel doing most of the talking, while Nate stood back with this quiet, easy warmth I never got the chance to actually know. He'd moved out of state for work not long after our wedding, and after Daniel died, the messages between us had faded the way they do with people who were really your spouse's friend, not fully your own. He'd come to the funeral, said all the right things, and then life had simply carried both of us in separate directions, the way it does. I hadn't heard his name in almost 2 years when my contractor for the kitchen renovation turned out to be him, back in town, running his own small renovation business now, after a stretch working for a larger company out west. I didn't know it yet, standing in that doorway, but the next 6 weeks were about to reopen parts of my life I'd very carefully sealed shut, one conversation at a time. The first few days were professional, careful, both of us clearly unsure how to navigate what we'd stumbled into. Nate was thorough with the work, quiet but not cold, occasionally letting slip a small detail about Daniel, a joke they used to share, a habit Daniel apparently never grew out of from their college years, before catching himself, like he wasn't sure if it was welcome. It was welcome, more than welcome, honestly. I found myself looking forward to those small, unplanned stories more than I expected to. By day 4, I'd started bringing him coffee without being asked, and we'd ended up talking for 20 minutes past when he should have gone home. He told me about the time Daniel had tried, badly, to learn guitar to impress a girl before we'd even met. A story I'd genuinely never heard in 6 years of marriage. He never told me that one, I said, laughing for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. There's about 40 more where that came from, Nate said, leaning against the counter he'd been measuring a moment earlier. I could probably write a book nobody asked for. He was an easy person to have stories about. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to take him up on that offer far more literally than either of us expected. Over the following 2 weeks, something shifted from professional politeness into something closer to real friendship. Nate would work through the morning, and most afternoons, we'd end up on my back porch with coffee going cold between us, while he told me piece after piece of Daniel's life I'd never had access to. The version of my husband that existed before me, loud and unfiltered in a way marriage and adulthood had gradually smoothed over. It felt, some days, like being handed back small pieces of a person I thought I'd already lost completely. I learned Daniel had wanted to be a marine biologist before switching majors twice, chasing whatever had briefly captured his attention that semester. I learned he'd once gotten genuinely banned from a campus dining hall for reasons Nate refused to fully explain, laughing too hard to finish the story properly, waving me off every time I pressed for details. I learned about the terrible apartment the two of them shared for a year after graduation, the one with the leaning refrigerator neither of them could afford to replace, and the running joke that outlasted the actual apartment by nearly a decade. I learned, carefully, gently, that Daniel had talked about me constantly in those early years after we met. How certain he'd been. How he'd told Nate on the phone the night we got engaged that he'd finally figured out what he actually wanted his life to look like. Nate said it quietly, almost hesitant, like he wasn't sure whether sharing it would comfort me or hurt me more. That last one caught in my throat in a way the others hadn't. I didn't know he said that, I said quietly. Nate was quiet for a moment too. He said a lot of things about you I probably shouldn't repeat, honestly. Some of it's gonna sound strange coming from me instead of him. I didn't fully understand what he meant by that yet. I would in about 2 weeks, and it was gonna complicate everything I thought I understood about why Nate had actually taken this particular job. My sister Priya noticed the shift before I was willing to admit it to myself. She'd stopped by one afternoon while Nate was finishing up, and afterward, once he'd left, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table with an expression I recognized from childhood, the one she used right before saying something I didn't want to hear. "You seem different around him," she said carefully. "Lighter. I haven't seen you like that in a long time." "He knew Daniel," I said. Like that explained everything. Like it wasn't already becoming more complicated than that simple sentence suggested. "That's exactly what worries me a little," Priya said. "Elise, I'm not saying anything's wrong with liking him. I'm saying, please be careful you're not confusing grief for something else. Or worse, confusing loyalty to Daniel's memory for actual feelings about Nate. Those are two very different things, and I don't think you've fully separated them yet." It was a fair concern, and I sat with it longer than I wanted to admit out loud. Because the honest truth was, I genuinely didn't know which one it was yet. Whether what I felt around Nate was about him, specifically, or about the parts of Daniel he kept accidentally handing back to me. I told Priya I'd be careful. I wasn't entirely sure, walking her to her car that evening, that I actually knew how. She hugged me longer than usual before she left, the way she used to right after Daniel died, and I understood, watching her drive off, that her concern came from love rather than judgment, even if it stung a little to hear out loud. I found out the real reason Nate had taken the job 3 weeks in, and I found out the way most real things get found out, accidentally, at the worst possible moment. I was looking for a specific mug in a box he'd moved during the renovation, and I found, instead, a folded piece of paper tucked into his tool bag by mistake, clearly not meant for me to see. It was a printed email, old, dated almost 2 years back, from Daniel to Nate. "I want to be honest about something," it started, "and I need you to actually hear it, instead of laughing it off like you always do. If something ever happens to me, and I know that sounds dramatic, but humor me, I need you to check on Elise. Not out of obligation, I need you to actually know her, the way I know her, because I don't trust many people to do that properly. You're the only person I'd trust with that." I sat down on my own kitchen floor holding that piece of paper for a long time before Nate found me there. I read it 3, maybe 4 times, trying to reconcile the version of Daniel who wrote something that formal and deliberate with the version I remembered laughing too loudly at his own jokes in this exact kitchen. He didn't try to explain it away or apologize immediately. He just sat down across from me on the floor, quietly, careful not to crowd the space I clearly needed, and waited until I was ready to say something. "How long have you had this?" I finally asked. "Since about a month after the funeral," he said. I didn't reach out right away, because I didn't know how, and then enough time passed that it felt strange to explain why I'd waited. When the renovation job came up through a mutual contact, I took it on purpose. I should have told you from day one. I'm sorry I didn't. "So this whole time," I said slowly, "the stories, the coffee, all of it, that was just you fulfilling a promise to a dead man?" "It started that way," Nate said, and something in his voice shifted, careful and direct. "I'd be lying if I said it stayed that way, though." I didn't know what to do with that answer immediately. Some part of me felt betrayed by the deception, however well-intentioned. Another part of me, a larger part, if I'm being fully honest, felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 3 years, and I didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. "I need you to actually answer something directly," I said. "Is this real, whatever this is between us? Or is this still just you honoring a promise to your best friend, and I'm confusing the two?" Nate didn't answer right away, which I respected more than an immediate response would have earned. When he finally spoke, he looked at me directly. "The promise got me in the door," he admitted. "I won't pretend otherwise, but somewhere around week 2, this stopped being about Daniel and started being about you, specifically. Not Daniel's wife. Not an obligation I inherited. You, Elise? I think I've been afraid to say that clearly because it felt like it might dishonor him somehow, caring about you the way I've started to. And now? I asked. Now I think he'd probably be furious at both of us for taking this long to just say it honestly. I found myself laughing, unexpectedly, through tears I hadn't fully noticed forming. That does sound like something he'd say. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon, but something had shifted between us that neither of us could pretend hadn't happened, promise or no promise. It's been about 8 months since I found that email on my kitchen floor. I won't pretend the path since then has been simple, because it genuinely hasn't. There were weeks I pulled back hard, needing distance to figure out if what I felt was real or just grief wearing a familiar face. Nate gave me that space without ever pushing, which honestly told me more about who he actually was than any of Daniel's old stories ever could have. Priya took nearly 4 months to fully come around, watching carefully before she trusted it wasn't just loneliness dressed up as something deeper. She and Nate get along genuinely well now, though she still, half joking, tells him she's keeping an eye on him. The kitchen got finished within its original 6 weeks, technically. Nate still finds excuses to come by more than a finished renovation would reasonably require, and I've stopped pretending I don't notice or that I mind. I found a photo a few weeks ago, tucked in an old box Nate had helped me sort through. Daniel and Nate, maybe 22 years old, arms around each other's shoulders outside some dorm building, both of them laughing at something neither of us will ever know the context of now. I keep it on the kitchen counter, in the room where all of this actually started. Some days I still feel guilty for being happy. Nate tells me, gently, every time it comes up, that guilt and gratitude can exist in the same life, the same way grief and new love apparently can too. I'm still learning to believe that fully. Some days I get closer than others. We don't talk in grand terms about what comes next, Nate and I. Neither of us feels the need to rush towards some big announcement, just to prove to anyone watching that this is serious. What we have instead is quieter than that, and somehow sturdier for it. Sunday mornings that turned, gradually, into every morning. A conversation, a few months back, about maybe finally repainting the guest room, the kind of small domestic plan that would have felt impossible to imagine a year earlier. He still, occasionally, tells me a Daniel story I haven't heard before, and I've stopped bracing for those moments to hurt. Mostly now, they just feel like a gift. I think about that email sometimes, the one that started all of this by accident. I don't know if Daniel actually imagined this exact outcome when he wrote it, or if he just wanted someone he trusted looking out for me in whatever shape that ended up taking. I've decided it doesn't entirely matter which one is true. What matters is that he was right about one thing. Nate really was the only person he'd have trusted with this. If you've ever had grief unexpectedly hand you something you weren't looking for, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story moved you, stay subscribed, because next week's story might hit just as close to home.